like to begin with our bracha, okay? And in the hopes that some others will be joining us shortly. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushenu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so remember that we are studying a book called Sefer HaChinuch, the book of Mitzvah education, as a way of seeing how it is that certain, let's say, mitzvot, commandments in the Torah, ultimately became established halakha and Jewish practice. And so far, we've seen that the author of our book has a certain structure. He likes to start off with what we've called a foundation verse. Okay? I can't help it. And from there, then explain the ramifications of that verse. And after that, he then discusses the various laws and when it's applicable, where it's applicable, for whom it's applicable. Excuse me. Okay? And so at the end of our last session, we began a slightly new topic, which I'm sort of going to review a little bit at the beginning today, and then move on with that. And remember, we said that he listed all of these mitzvot in the order that Maimonides established in his Sefer HaMitzvot, listing from number 1, which we looked at the very beginning, Peru Urvu, be fruitful and multiply, all the way up to what he listed as mitzvah number 613. So the one we're going to look at today, okay, in just a moment, is number 386. Okay, so if we look here, okay, it's the precept of tzitzit, tassels on the four-cornered garment. And we pointed out at the end of, as I say, last week, that what's a little bit problematic for us, as we see at the beginning, is that rather than just cite one verse, he actually cites 2 verses as his foundation. Okay? One, okay, he cites from Numbers 15:38, and he only cites part of the verse, that they shall make themselves fringes. The full verse, okay, is Bamidbar, Numbers, okay, 15:38. Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them throughout their generations fringes in the corners of their garments, and that they put with a fringe of each corner a thread of blue. So he only cites here the first part of the verse. Okay? Nothing about the additional fringe or one of the fringes having to be of a specific color. He then points out that this is not the only place, excuse me, where the Torah refers to what we call tzitzit, or tassels, by citing part of a verse in Devarim, in Deuteronomy 22:12, on the 4 corners of your cloak. Now that verse reads in full, thou shalt make thee twisted cords upon the four corners of thy covering, wherewith thou coverest thyself. So again, he only cites part of the verse. So our first question was, why do we think it was necessary for him to cite both verses? Okay. One answer we can suggest is that our first verse only says making fringes. It doesn't define anything about the garment. It doesn't say what size it is. It doesn't say how many corners the garment has to have. It doesn't say who is supposed to do it. Okay. Things of that nature. Okay. And so at least by then bringing our second pasuk, our second verse from Devarim, we see that it implies that it has to be a garment of four corners. So if you ask yourselves the question, specifically four, or is four the minimum? Maybe a garment of five corners. Okay? What about this? But that doesn't answer still the size of the garment. If we look again at the end of that verse from Deuteronomy, from Devarim, it said, wherewith you covers yourself. So let's take just a brief example as we continue. If we're familiar with a garment known as a serape, okay? It's almost like a large sheet with a hole in the middle, okay? Poncho, something like that, okay? We're familiar with that kind of an item, whether it's a rain poncho or another kind, where it fits over your head and it has corners, but certainly the size of a poncho is usually adequate for an adult. Okay? Is that the kind of garment they're talking about? Or maybe it could be a smaller garment. Right? So neither of our verses clearly define those questions that we've asked. The size of the garment, okay? The age of the person, at what point must one wear such a garment? Or a further question, what is the garment made from? Does it have to be wool? Could it be linen? Could it be silk? Right? We know that elsewhere, the Torah has a clear statement about, okay, about something called shatnez, a mixture of linen and wool. Those garments are prohibited. So we can assume, basically, that that excludes that kind of garment. Okay? But it still doesn't answer some of our other questions. And so, again, we have to assume, where did our author derive his explanation as we look further on the page? Okay? So he tells us, this includes clothing with 5 or more than 4. So that's the first example. It's got to be 4 minimally in terms of corners, but it could have more. So let's take an example. Let's assume that I'm living in a colder climate, as I used to, and I have one of those, what we'll call stadium scarves. Okay? I think we're generally familiar with it. They're long scarves that you can wrap around your neck. Okay? If you've seen those in pictures or you have one, or perhaps family members have one, if we think about it, is that considered a garment? Certainly it probably has 4 corners. Would tzitzit then be necessary on such a scarf? Again, we have questions that he has not helped us to define yet, except by telling us through the second verse that it's got to be a minimum of 4 corners. But where did he derive that? We have to assume that he got it from the Talmud. And here's the part of the Talmud's discussion. Citing that same verse, the second verse, right? Now Talmud focuses on the second half of the verse, where it said, when you covers yourself. Okay? And the Gemara, the Talmud asks, what does it mean? On the 4 corners of your garment. Okay? Indicates to attach ritual fringes to a garment that has 4 corners, but not to one that has 3 corners. So the Talmud continues. Do you say that a garment with 4 corners is obligated, but not a garment with 3 corners? Or is it teaching you only that a garment with 4 corners is obligated, but not a garment with 5 corners?
Oh,
Okay?
okay.
So the Gemara is trying to determine, when it said 4 corners, is it only that, or is that the minimum? And so the Gemara goes on. On the 4 corners of your garment, it teaches that this obligation is limited to a garment that has 4 corners, but not to one that has 3 corners. Okay? Now, further on, in the same page of the Gemara, okay, and elsewhere, we see more discussion in regards to the question of the 5-cornered garment. But we're not going to read that at the moment in detail. Instead, I want us to see the second part about one of the questions we asked. Okay? Now, whose measure is large enough? How big? It says it has to cover one, so that a child who can walk about in the marketplace without a guardian can cover his head and most of his body with it. So how old do you think that child has to be? Okay. If you want to unmute and make a suggestion, that's okay. All right. Would we say 4? Would we say 6, 7? Right? Okay. So again, the question is, it has to be a garment large enough to cover a young boy, okay, a young child. And once more, okay, we would have to turn to the Talmud, as did our author, okay, who found also in the Gemara Menachot the following discussion. What is meant by a cloak that is exempt from ritual fringes? If we say that it is referring to a cloak that is not of the size necessary to require the affixing of fringes, that's difficult. But isn't it taught in a Braita with regard to a cloak that is large enough for a minor to cover his head and most of his body with it? Now, the reason I'm, for the moment, focusing on that particular aspect is because it helps us understand that there are actually 2 different kinds of garment with tzitzit, right? If we think about it, there's something called a talis katan,
Right.
okay? Something that is similar to a poncho, okay? Or a kind of
Correct.
rape.
Yeah.
Simply fits over one's head, okay? And it has 4 corners, and one is able to wear it either under a shirt or over a shirt, so that the tzitzit, the fringes, are accessible. As opposed to a large talit, okay, cloak, garment, like we normally see in the synagogue, which is a much larger garment with also 4 corners. So we understand, therefore, that that's why the idea of a talis katan exists, so that it has to be large enough to cover the head and body of a small child to go out of the doors. Okay. Now, our author here in Sefer HaChinuch actually suggests an age, therefore. This age would seem to be about 6 or 7. Okay. So that tells us at what point, okay, a child, specifically we're going to talk about it as a boy, okay, should start wearing a talis katan. By the way, most people, even though they accept that as the halacha, will tell you that ideally they try to start a young boy wearing a talis katan, okay, at a younger age, so long as they have already been trained, okay, in terms of use of a bathroom facility. Okay, so that could mean somebody, say, as young as 5 years old as well. Okay, now we have answered the question, what's the size? We've answered the question, what's the age of the person? Okay, but we have not yet answered the question, what is the garment to be made from? Okay, our writer, our author, tells us, and the garment must be of wool or linen. Okay? Here again, we know clearly that the Torah prohibits a garment mixing those 2 items. Okay? But once more, where did the author of Sefer HaChinuch get that answer? He derives it again from a statement once more in the Talmud, in the same tractate, Menachot, a couple of pages after we saw previously, where it says as follows, Shmuel says in the name of Levi, wool strings exempt a garment of linen. In other words, one fulfills the mitzvah of tzitzit, of the tassels, by affixing wool strings to a linen garment. But the Gemara goes on then and raises a question. What about the opposite? Could I put linen strings on a wool garment? Okay. Don't we have this prohibition that says mixing linen and wool together? Okay. And so again, the Gemara answers, since it is written, you shall not wear diverse kinds, wool and linen together, you shall prepare yourself twisted cords. In other words, they take the verse that comes in the Torah and Devarim with Deuteronomy before our example of Deuteronomy 22:12 that talks about the prohibition and points out that these 2 verses do not have to be in conflict, that there is one exception to the example of a garment that has wool and linen together, and that exemption is a talit. Okay? And that's what the Gemara then continued to say. Right? There is no difference whether one affixes wool strings to a garment of linen, and there is no difference whether one affixes linen strings to a garment of wool. So that discussion therefore teaches us so far and answers for us at this point those few questions that we had about why both verses are used and how the Talmud attempted to define them. Okay? Now, we said after presenting the discussion of the foundation verses, okay, our author went on to talk a little bit more about four corners or more or less, or the kind of garment, okay, things like that, right, which we're not going to go into, okay, in detail, okay, but I do want us to go on to the next page as we adjust it, okay? And here we see he's now going to begin to explain for us in more detail, okay? What is the purpose of wearing fringes, of the tzitzit, okay? And therefore, what does he do? Okay? He continues his discussion, okay, and tells us that it is in order that we should remember all of the mitzvot of the eternal Lord constantly. Where does he derive that from? Okay, his example, okay, again, comes from the Torah, and that's what he cites for us. Okay, the verse that followed his initial choice of verses, the one he started with from Bamidbar, Numbers 15:38, which went on then to say in the next verse, and you shall remember all the commandments of the Lord. Again, I'm going to share that verse in its completely, okay? And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that ye go not about after your own heart and your own eyes, after which ye used to go astray. Okay. So, by citing at least the first part of the verse, he attempts to tell us what is the purpose of wearing tzitzit. It's a reminder, okay? An example that we might use that perhaps we can identify with is the old idea of people would tie a string around their finger. Okay, if you ever saw that, people do it or saw it in a cartoon or something, okay, as a reminder. Okay. So here too, this garment, these fringes are supposed to be a reminder, okay, to tell us to remember the mitzvot. But unfortunately, okay, how do we then get the fact that there are numerous mitzvot, and how will these fringes remind us of that? We're going to see that momentarily, okay? But before he discusses that issue, he's going to suggest, okay, something else, okay? And what he wants to suggest for us, okay, is the following. Based on that verse, to remember the commandments, there's an interesting statement in Rashi. He says the following, that tzitzit will remind one of all the commandments because the numerical value of the letters of the word tzitzit is 600. Okay? If we figure that Sadi is 90 and the Yud is 10, the second Sadi is another 90 and the Yud is 10. So now we get 200. And the last letter is equal to 400. So we get 600. Rashi continues, and there are 8 threads and 5 knots in the fringes. Okay? So that you have 613, which is also the number of the commandments of the Torah. Okay? You can surmise that Rashi must get this from the Midrash or from the Talmud. However, Rashi is not satisfied by giving this explanation. Okay? What he does instead is he comes back to this verse, okay, and then cites the second part of the verse. Remember, I read to you the fact that the second part said, and you go not about after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you used to go astray. Okay? And so therefore, Rashi's second explanation, the verb has lo taturu acharei levavchem in the Hebrew. You shall not search after your own heart. That verb, says Rashi, is similar to another verb in another verse, and they returned from searching the land in regard to the spies. And therefore, what he tells us is all what we would call now a moral explanation. The heart and the eyes are the spies of the body. They act as its agents for sinning. The eye sees, the heart covets, and the body commits the sin. Okay? So we see that Rashi gives us, if you will, 2 explanations how these fringes are supposed to remind us of the commandments. One, what we might call an example of gematria, of numbers. The word tzitzit, 600, plus 8 hanging fringes, 5 double knots, 13, 613. The other, the second explanation that Rashi's given, okay, which is based on the idea that it is a moral issue, okay? Now, if we look back in our text here of Sefer HaChinuch, we see that he gives the first explanation, the 613, right? 8 threads, 5 knots, okay, as we see, right? And over here, the footnote does the arithmetic for us, okay? But then he decides to give a, if you will, a moral explanation, following the example of Rashi. But he doesn't use Rashi's text as his basis about the eyes and the heart being spies. Instead, he gives a rather different approach, okay, which we might call a bit more sermonic. He tells us that the tassels, the fringes, are 2 colors, white and blue.
Right.
And therefore the white refers to the body, the earth, the physical aspects of a human life. Why? Okay, similar to snow, which is white. Okay, the threads also allude to the body, okay? Because he points out again an example, this time from the Talmud, okay, that threads are like threads of a human body when it's in embryo. Okay? Here, the two thighs, two threads of crimson silk, the two arms, two threads of crimson silk. Okay? So he wants to say, on the one hand, the fringes should remind us of our physicality. Right? On the other hand, he now then proceeds to tell us that the techelet, the blue, okay, of which one fringe is supposed to ideally be used to wrap around the others, is reminiscent of the heavenly firmament, the upper realms. Okay? And he cites again from the Talmud, okay, this example, okay, as well. Okay, and gives us the actual Talmud text, okay, where he gives us here, okay, because techelet, the blue, resembles the sea resembles the sky, and the sky resembles the throne of glory. Okay, citing the verse, okay, and another verse from Ezekiel, implying then that the techelet, okay, which is wound around the white threads, for the spirit is upper in origin, and the body is of lower realm. So his sermonic explanation is basically, besides the numbers, that when we look on the tzitzit, it should remind us not only of our physical self, and that some mitzvot deal with our physical body, but the blue ideally, and that, remember, for many, when they could not find the animal that produced the blue dye, became part of the garment, the talis itself. So that's to remind us of heaven. Okay? So we have an example, if you will, of the commandments that are physical, or what I'll call bein adam lechavero, between one person and another person. And the blue should remind us of those commandments towards heaven, bein adam lemakom. Okay? So we have both moral commandments and ritual commandments, okay? Or we could call them physical and spiritual commandments. And in that way also, says our author, it should remind us of all of the commandments and that we should follow them appropriately. Okay. Now, as we continue a little bit further, okay, we're not going to read this section in detail, okay, but I do want us to be aware of the fact that as he continues, and I'm going to go over to the next section, okay? In this section, in the paragraph just before it, he tells us how the fringes are to be tied, okay? As I say, we're not going to go into that right today, okay, at this point, but if you look at your own talus, you can see, okay, that is a certain number of wraparounds in between each double knot, okay, and then afterwards you have 8 threads hanging down, okay. By the way, if one ties their own tzitzit to a talus, okay, we know that one is not permitted to take a utensil like a scissors to cut the extra fringe. Okay. Now, having presented us with this idea, he's going to continue now with a general review of some of the laws, okay? Some of which we're familiar with already. Cloak has to have, we said, at least 4 corners. He tells us that. But he also points out that the fringes are not tied directly to the corner, but there's got to be some space, okay, in between. He talks about the blue dyed thread, okay? And tells us that in his day, we today do not find the techelet, the proper blue dye, okay? In other words, he points that out. However, in Israel, there is an organization that suggests that they have found that animal from which they can derive the dye, and they do sell, okay, a proper fringes with the blue dye on it already, okay, and that's what he talks about here, that it's a certain water creature called chilazon, okay, and it is found in the Mediterranean, okay, and if you ever have a chance to go to Israel, I strongly encourage you to try to visit their institute, where they actually will show a film as to how people collect the dye. Okay. All right. Let's look on further. Okay. And okay. He goes now to tell us that it's spun from wool, okay, and not from the tufts of an animal, okay, and some of the specific details in the making of the threads and the making of a talus. They're not to be made of wool seized by robbery, things of that nature. Okay. He then says, what about if the talit was made by a non-Jew? After all, they could easily make a garment with fringes. That's not acceptable, he points out, because here too, it says you shall make for yourselves the fringes. In other words, it's got to be made by somebody Jewish with the kavanah, with the improper intent. He then, again, goes into some more detail as to how the threads are made. Now, we might just quickly ask, why did he feel the need to go into such detail? Because it was simply the fact that, there was not a local Judaica store that somebody could go into and buy a talus katan or buy a talus. Okay?
Yeah.
Right? Fortunate that they had to arrange for these things, and many people would make and tie their own. So he wants to give the whole distinction, the whole explanation of how it was done. Okay? Right? That's where he continued. Right? However, we're going to, as I say, not deal with that today. And I want us to here, okay, he goes into a little bit more detail. Okay. What about if you borrow a talus, okay, which doesn't have tzitzis on it? Okay. That's not usually our case today. Usually if we borrow somebody's talus, it has tzitzit on it. But let's say there's a situation that we can learn from, right? And what he's trying to suggest to us in this case is something that I want us to look at. Okay. Right. And here. Okay. A little bit further to in the bottom paragraph. He says he's gone into detail, okay, about how to put it on, how to tie the tzitzit together. But then